He didn't yell. That was the worst part. He simply stood by the grand fireplace, pouring himself a brandy, and said the words that would define their marriage. "You were never my choice." He expected tears. He expected a plea, or perhaps a hysterical fit. Instead, she smoothed the skirts of her heavily embroidered gown, dipped into a flawless mocking curtsy, and walked out the door without a backward glance. Welcome to the reality of a grand society marriage. The church had smelled of damp wool and ancient dust. Amelia remembered that detail above all others. Not the vows, not the heavy gold ring sliding onto her finger, just the overwhelming scent of decay that seemed to seep from the very stones of St. George's. It was a fitting aroma for the day she bought a husband. Aidan Somerset, the Duke of Rothbury, was practically a ghost. His family's wealth had dried up 2 generations prior, leaving him with an echoing estate in the country, a crumbling townhouse in Mayfair, and a mountain of creditors threatening to drag his pristine name through the mud. Amelia's father, Thomas Osgood, possessed the opposite problem. He had more money than God, pulled from the soot and sweat of northern coal mines, but his blood was common. He wanted a duchess for a daughter, so a transaction was made. Now they stood in the sprawling library of Rothbury House. The wedding breakfast was over. The guests had departed, whispering behind their hands about the bride's plain face and the groom's grim expression. Aidan stood by the hearth. The fire was unlit. Coal was expensive, even if Amelia's father owned the mines. Aidan stared at the empty grate, his broad shoulders stiff beneath his tailored broadcloth coat. He poured a glass of cheap brandy from a crystal decanter. Amelia waited near the door. She wore a traveling gown of dark blue velvet. It was heavy. It dragged at her shoulders. She wanted nothing more than to unlace her corset and sleep for a week. Aidan didn't turn around when he spoke. His voice was a low, aristocratic drawl, stripped of any warmth. "Let us dispense with the theatricals, Amelia. I have no interest in playing the blushing groom, and I assume you are pragmatic enough to drop the charade of the hopeful bride." Amelia remained silent. She crossed her hands over her stomach. Aidan finally turned. His eyes were a startling pale gray. They were beautiful eyes, set in a sharp, unforgiving face. Right now, they were filled with a profound, simmering resentment. "You have your title," he continued, taking a slow sip of the brandy. "Your father has his prize. My debts are paid. We have done our duty." He set the glass down on the mantelpiece with a sharp click. "But do not look at me with those wide, expectant eyes. Do not seek me out in the dark, hoping for a romance that does not exist. You were never my choice. Had my father not gambled away our legacy, I would have married a scullery maid before allying myself with your family's soot-stained money." The silence that followed was absolute. It pressed against the walls of the library. Aidan watched her. He was bracing for the explosion. He had seen women weep, scream, throw vases, or collapse into delicate, strategic swoons. He had prepared himself to weather the storm of a woman scorned on her wedding day. He thought he was doing them both a favor. Better to sever the limb immediately than let it fester with false hope. Amelia felt the words hit her chest like physical blows. Her ribs ached. Her throat tightened. She had known, of course. She wasn't an idiot. She knew Aidan didn't love her. But the sheer cruelty of laying it bare, of stripping away even the polite fiction of their arrangement, was breathtaking. She looked at him. She saw the defensive set of his jaw. She saw the pride that was eating him alive from the inside out. She did not cry. Crying was for women who had something to lose. Amelia stepped back. She took the heavy velvet of her skirts in both hands. She kept her spine rigidly straight, her chin parallel to the floor. She sank into a deep, mathematically perfect curtsy. It was the sort of curtsy one offered to a monarch or an enemy. She rose slowly. Her brown eyes met his gray ones. She offered no smile, no frown, only a terrifying blank neutrality. "Then I shall leave you to your brandy, your grace." She turned on her heel. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind her. Aidan stood alone in the library. He picked up his glass. His hand, he noticed with intense annoyance, was shaking. Fenwick Castle was not a home. It was a monument to a dying dynasty. When Amelia arrived 2 days later, traveling in a separate carriage from her new husband by mutual, unspoken agreement, she stepped out into a courtyard choked with weeds. The stone walls were black with damp. The roof sagged over the west wing like a crushed top hat. Inside, it was worse. The air was frigid. The tapestries were moth-eaten. The servants, few and elderly, looked at Amelia not with deference but with a sullen, protective suspicion. Aidan vanished immediately. He took his horse and rode out into the sprawling, neglected acreage, leaving her standing in the grand foyer with her trunks. A weaker woman would have locked herself in a bedchamber and wept into her pillow. Amelia tied a linen apron over her silk day dress, summoned the housekeeper, and asked for the estate ledgers. The housekeeper, a sour-faced woman named Mrs. Gable, handed them over with a sneer. "The Duke handles the accounts, Your Grace." "The Duke," Amelia replied evenly, flipping open the first leather-bound book, "has evidently been handling them with a blindfold on. Fetch me a pot of strong tea, Mrs. Gable, and send for the village carpenter. The draft in the east corridor is entirely unacceptable." For the next month, Amelia did not act as a wife. She acted as a foreman. She possessed her father's ruthless head for numbers and a staggering dowry that Aidan, in his pride, had refused to touch beyond paying off his immediate creditors. Amelia had no such pride. She bled her own accounts into the estate. She fired the steward who had been skimming profits from the tenant farms. She hired a sharp, hungry young man from London to replace him. She brought in roofers. She bought coal, mountains of it. Slowly, Fenwick Castle began to thaw. Aidan watched this transformation with a mix of bafflement and irritation. He would return from a long, punishing ride across the moors to find the fires blazing in the hearths. The constant gnawing chill that had lived in his bones since childhood was suddenly gone. The meals at the long dining table shifted from boiled mutton and stale bread to roasted pheasant, fresh vegetables, and rich pastries. He didn't know how to handle it. He felt displaced. His martyrdom was being systematically dismantled by a woman who barely acknowledged his existence. They lived like two ghosts, haunting the same house. When they passed each other in the corridors, Amelia would offer a shallow nod. "Your Grace." "Madam?" That was the extent of their communion. At dinner, they sat 20 feet apart at the mahogany table. The silence between them was thick, heavy, and impenetrable. Aidan would sneak glances at her over his wine glass. She was always composed. Her dark hair was styled immaculately. Her gowns were rich but understated. She ate with quiet precision, never initiating conversation, never looking his way. He realized with a crawling sense of unease that she was entirely self-sufficient. He had drawn a line in the sand on their wedding day, and she hadn't just respected it. She had built a fortress on her side of it. One evening, a violent thunderstorm rolled over the moors. Rain lashed against the tall windows of the dining room. Thunder rattled the glassware. Aidan looked down the table. Amelia was cutting a slice of beef, her hand perfectly steady. "The roof in the west wing," Aidan said. It was the first time he had initiated a conversation in 3 weeks. His voice sounded loud, harsh in the quiet room. "It usually leaks in weather like this. The buckets will need to be set out." Amelia didn't look up from her plate. "I had the slates replaced on Tuesday. There are no leaks." Aidan set his fork down. A strange, sour feeling twisted in his gut. It wasn't gratitude. It was emasculation. "You shouldn't have done that without consulting me. This is my house." Amelia finally lifted her eyes. They caught the flickering candlelight, looking dark and ancient. "This is your house," she agreed softly. "But it is my money keeping the rain off your head. If you prefer to sit in a puddle for the sake of your pride, Aidan, do let me know. I can easily have the workmen remove the slates tomorrow." She took a sip of her water, placed her napkin on the table, and stood. "Enjoy the rest of your meal." She walked out. Aidan sat alone in the massive room, listening to the rain beat harmlessly against the repaired roof, feeling like an absolute fool. The isolation broke in late November. It arrived in the form of a grand carriage bearing the crest of the Earl of Linfield. Out stepped Aidan's sister, Lady Clara, and her husband, a man whose waistline was matched only by his arrogance. Clara was a striking woman, possessing the same sharp aristocratic features as Aidan, but without any of the underlying melancholy. Where Aidan was a storm, Clara was a polished blade. She had married well and delighted in looking down upon those who hadn't. Aidan had forgotten they were coming. Amelia had not. When Clara swept into the foyer, demanding a footman for her velvet cloaks, Amelia was waiting. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk. It was a severe cut, devoid of lace or frills, relying entirely on the devastating expense of the fabric to make an impression. "Clara," Aidan said, coming down the stairs, rubbing his temples, "I didn't realize you were due today." "Evidently," Clara sniffed, eyeing the polished floors and the lack of cobwebs with mild suspicion. "Your bride, however, seems prepared." She turned her gaze to Amelia. It was a look that measured, weighed, and found severely wanting. "You must be the Osgood girl." "I am the Duchess of Rothbury," Amelia corrected. Her voice was mild, pleasant. Clara laughed. It sounded like breaking glass. "Of course you are. How quaint." Dinner was a battlefield. Aidan sat at the head of the table, a mounting headache throbbing behind his eyes. He hated his brother-in-law, who spent the first 2 courses loudly complaining about the state of the roads and the insolence of the working class. Clara, however, focused her sights entirely on Amelia. "I must say, the castle looks different, Aidan," Clara noted, taking a delicate bite of her salmon. "Less authentic. It smells distinctly of new paint and elbow grease, very industrious. Tell me, Amelia, did you learn to scrub floors in your father's collieries before he bought his way into a parlor?" Aidan stiffened. He opened his mouth to intervene, a sudden protective instinct flaring in his chest. It was one thing for him to dismiss his wife. It was entirely another for Clara to insult a guest, the lady of the house, under his roof. He didn't get the chance. Amelia dabbed her lips with her napkin. She looked at Clara with an expression of gentle pity. "I never scrubbed floors, Clara," Amelia said. Her tone was conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "My father employed people to do that, thousands of them, actually. It is a remarkable thing, industry. It builds cities, it moves nations." She paused, tilting her head slightly. "It also, as I understand it, currently holds the mortgage on your husband's hunting lodge in Yorkshire. But please, don't let me bore you with the mechanics of high finance. It can be so taxing for those unused to mathematics." The table went dead silent. Lord Linfield choked on his wine. Clara's pale face flushed a violent, ugly red. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Aidan stared at his wife. He felt a sudden shocking jolt in his chest. It was a laugh. He swallowed it down instantly, terrified it would escape, but the sheer force of it widened his eyes. Amelia hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't flushed with anger. She had simply taken a surgical knife and severed Clara at the knees with absolute, terrifying grace. The rest of the meal passed in a suffocating, hostile silence. Clara retired to her room immediately after dessert, complaining of a migraine. Linfield followed. Aidan and Amelia were left alone in the drawing room. The fire cracked in the hearth. Aidan stood by the mantel, holding a glass of port. He watched Amelia as she sat in a high-backed chair, opening a book of poetry as if she hadn't just verbally eviscerated an earl's wife. He saw her differently now. The plainness of her face was overshadowed by the fierce, calculating intelligence in her eyes. The rigidity of her posture wasn't awkwardness, it was armor. That was... Aidan started, searching for the word. Ruthless. Amelia didn't look up from her book. She was poorly mannered. I merely corrected her posture. Aidan took a step closer. He felt a strange magnetic pull toward her. The wall she had built was suddenly the most fascinating thing in his world. He wanted to see what was behind it. "You surprised me," he said, his voice dropping an octave, softening into something dangerously close to a compliment. "You handle yourself beautifully, Amelia." Amelia slowly closed her book. She looked up at him. There was no warmth in her gaze, no flutter of eyelashes. "Do not mistake my defense of my family for a desire to impress you, Aidan," she said, her voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "I am perfectly capable of surviving your sister, just as I am perfectly capable of surviving you." She stood up, the emerald silk rustling like dry leaves. "Good night, Your Grace." She curtsied, that same flawless mocking dip she had given him on their wedding day, and walked away, leaving him staring at her retreating back, a man who was suddenly, terrifyingly aware of exactly what he had thrown away. Winter descended on Fenwick Castle not with a picturesque snowfall, but with a biting, relentless frost that turned the ground to iron. Aidan found himself doing something he had not done in years, staying indoors. Previously, the oppressive gloom of the estate had driven him out onto the moors, riding his stallion to exhaustion, just to escape the echoing halls of his own failure. Now, the halls were warm. The fires roared in the grates. The smell of roasting meats and spiced wine drifted from the kitchens. The house was alive. But the woman who had resurrected it was a ghost. Aidan began to track her. It wasn't a conscious decision at first. He simply noticed the rhythm of her days. Breakfast at 7, taken alone in the small morning room. From 8 until noon, she was barricaded in the study, flanked by the new steward and a mountain of ledgers. The afternoons were spent directing the army of staff she had recruited from the surrounding villages. She was a machine. She possessed an inexhaustible, terrifying stamina. He started finding excuses to be in her orbit. He would linger in the corridor when she spoke with the housekeeper. He would sit by the fire in the drawing room, pretending to read a newspaper, just to watch her cross the floor. He noticed the details he had been entirely blind to on their wedding day. She had a habit of tucking a stray lock of dark hair behind her left ear when she was doing mathematics in her head. She smelled consistently of bergamot and sharp, clean soap. She never wore the ostentatious jewels her father had gifted her. Her only adornment was the heavy gold wedding band she wore like a shackle. The indifference he had demanded of her was now choking him. On a bleak Tuesday in December, Aidan walked into the study. Amelia was seated at the massive oak desk that had belonged to his grandfather. She was framed by the gray light spilling from the tall windows, a smear of ink on her right index finger. She didn't look up when the door clicked shut. "The timber contracts for the Northern Ridge," Aidan said. His voice sounded too loud in the quiet room. Amelia carefully laid her pen down on the blotter. She looked at him. Her expression was the same blank canvas she presented to him every day. "Yes? I want to review them." It was a clumsy overture. He knew nothing about timber contracts. For 3 years, he'd let the forests rot and the gamekeepers poach the deer. Amelia slid a thick folder across the polished wood of the desk. She didn't question him. She didn't mock his sudden interest. She simply surrendered the paperwork. Aidan walked forward and picked up the folder. He stood there, looking down at her. The top of her head was inches from his chest. He could see the pale, fragile line of her neck where her collar dipped. He felt a sudden, violent urge to reach out and touch it, to see if her skin was as cold as her demeanor. He tightened his grip on the leather folder. "Are they favorable?" he asked. "They are fair," Amelia replied, her eyes returning to the ledger in front of her. "The previous buyer was underpaying by 30%. I've secured a new merchant from York. The profits will cover the repairs to the tenant cottages by spring." "You work too hard," Aidan said. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Amelia paused. Her pen hovered over the paper. She looked back up at him, a faint humorless crease appearing between her brows. "I am protecting an investment, Your Grace," she said. "A businessman does not sleep when his capital is at risk, and my father invested heavily in this estate." The reminder felt like a slap. This is a transaction. She was throwing his own terms back in his face. "You are not a businessman, Amelia. You are my wife." She leaned back in her chair. The heavy wool of her bodice shifted slightly as she took a slow, deliberate breath. Am I?" she asked, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I recall a very specific conversation in the library of Rothbury House where I was informed otherwise. I believe the phrase was, 'You were never my choice.'" Aidan felt the blood drain from his face. Hearing the words spoken back to him in that quiet, even tone, stripped of the anger he had felt when he said them, was agonizing. "I was angry," he said, his voice grating in his throat. "I was proud, and I was backed into a corner by men who saw my name as a commodity." "I understand entirely," Amelia said. She picked up her pen again. "Which is why I do not expect anything from you, Aidan. I expect nothing. I ask for nothing. We have a highly functional arrangement. Let us not ruin it with sentimentality." "It doesn't have to be just an arrangement," he pressed, taking a step closer to the desk. "We are married. We have 50 years ahead of us." Amelia dipped her pen into the inkwell. The scratch of the metal nib against the paper was the only sound in the room for a long moment. "The timber contracts are in the folder, Your Grace," she said softly. "Please close the door behind you when you leave." Aidan stood there for 5 agonizing seconds. He looked at the rigid set of her shoulders. She was completely sealed off, a fortress of practicalities and ledgers. He turned and walked out of the room. The door clicked shut. Amelia's hand trembled, sending a jagged, ugly line of black ink across the immaculate ledger page. She stared at it, her chest rising and falling in shallow, sharp breaths. She carefully laid the pen down, pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, and waited for her pulse to slow. The invitation to the winter solstice ball at Harrington House was not a request. It was a summons. Lord Harrington was the oldest peer in the county, a man who viewed newly minted wealth with the same revulsion one might view a rat in the pantry. He had invited the Duke and Duchess of Rothbury out of rigid societal obligation, fully expecting them to decline. Aidan insisted they go. He told himself it was about maintaining appearances. The county needed to see that the Duke of Rothbury was no longer a reclusive debtor. But deep down, he knew the truth. He wanted to pull Amelia out of the castle. He wanted to force her into a carriage with him, to see her dressed in something other than sensible wool and linen, to shake the unyielding foundation she had built beneath herself. The carriage ride was an hour of torture. The air outside was freezing, the road slick with ice. Inside the cramped carriage, they were forced to sit thigh to thigh. Aidan could feel the heat radiating from her under the heavy fur lap blanket. Amelia stared out the frosted window into the pitch-black night. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk, cut daringly low across her collarbones, a heavy diamond pendant resting against her skin. It was the first time she had worn her father's jewelry. It was armor. "You look beautiful," Aidan said into the heavy silence. Amelia didn't blink. "Thank you. My dressmaker in London is very expensive." Aidan clenched his jaw and looked away. When they arrived at Harrington House, the ballroom was a crush of velvet, candlelight, and suffocating heat. The moment their names were announced, the music seemed to dip. Eyes turned toward them. A collective, glittering judgment settled over the room. Aidan offered his arm. Amelia took it. Her grip was light, entirely devoid of reliance. They waded into the crowd. The snubs were not outright. These people were too well bred for shouting. It was the turned shoulders, the conversations that abruptly paused when they approached, the overly polite, hollow smiles directed at Amelia, the coal miner's daughter. Aidan felt his temper rising, a hot, metallic taste in his mouth. He glared at a viscount who deliberately stepped into Amelia's path, forcing her to alter her course. Amelia remained utterly unfazed. She navigated the hostility with the same terrifying, blank grace she used to navigate him. She sipped her champagne. She nodded at the correct moments. She was flawless. "Dance with me," Aidan demanded quietly, midway through the evening. The string quartet was striking up a waltz. Amelia looked at the floor. "I do not think that is wise." "I don't care what is wise. Dance with me." He didn't wait for an answer. He took her glass, set it on a passing servant's tray, and led her onto the floor. When he pulled her into his arms, the shock of it rattled him down to his bones. Her waist was narrow beneath his hand. He stepped into the rhythm of the waltz, pulling her closer than was strictly proper. Amelia moved perfectly. She followed his lead without hesitation. But she was rigid. Every muscle in her back was tight. She kept her gaze fixed on the gold buttons of his waistcoat. "Look at me," he murmured over the swell of the violins. She lifted her chin. Her dark eyes met his. They were guarded, flat. "They are vultures," Aidan said, nodding slightly toward the crowd watching them. "You don't have to pretend you don't notice. You don't have to be perfect." "I am not pretending, Aidan, and I do not care what these people think of me. They are irrelevant." "And what about me?" he asked. The music swelled, drowning his voice out to anyone but her. "Am I irrelevant?" For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. He saw a flash of raw, unfiltered pain in her eyes. It was there and gone so fast he thought he might have imagined it, replaced instantly by the familiar, impenetrable ice. "You are my husband," she said smoothly. "We are dancing. Let us leave it at that." The carriage ride home was worse than the journey there. The silence was no longer empty. It was pressurized. Aidan poured himself a glass of whiskey from the carriage's small decanter. The carriage hit a rut in the road, throwing Amelia slightly against him. She immediately righted herself, sliding to the far edge of the velvet seat. The physical rejection snapped the last wire of Aidan's patience. "Stop it!" he growled. Amelia turned her head. "I beg your pardon?" "Stop acting as if my touch is going to burn you. Stop retreating every time I try to bridge this damn gap between us." Amelia's posture went terrifyingly still. The air in the carriage seemed to freeze. "You do not get to dictate how I react to you, Aidan," she said. Her voice was low, vibrating with a tightly coiled fury he had never heard before. "You do not get to draw a line in the sand, tell me I am a burden, and then complain when I refuse to cross it." "I made a mistake," Aidan shouted, the sound cracking against the small confines of the carriage. He slammed his glass down. "I was a bitter, humiliated man who lashed out at the only person standing in front of him. I was wrong. I see you now. I see what you've done for the estate, for me." "You see my usefulness," Amelia snapped back, the ice finally shattering. She turned fully toward him, her eyes blazing in the dim light of the carriage lantern. "You see that my money has made your life comfortable. You see that I do not embarrass you in front of the Harringtons. Do not confuse gratitude with affection, Your Grace. It is insulting to us both." "It isn't gratitude," he reached out, grabbing her wrist. Her skin was warm, her pulse hammering against his thumb. "Amelia, please." She yanked her hand away with brutal force. "Do not touch me." She breathed heavily, pressing her back against the carriage wall. The diamond pendant heaved against her chest. "You told me I was never your choice," she whispered, the anger bleeding out of her, leaving something much more devastating in its wake. "You told me to drop the charade. Well, I dropped it, Aidan. I built a life here where I do not need your approval, your affection, or your choice. I survived you." She looked away, staring back out the frosted window. "Do not try to dismantle my survival just because you are suddenly bored of the quiet." Aidan sat back in the shadows. The whiskey burned in his throat. He looked at the woman he had married, the woman he had carelessly broken on their very first day, and realized with a sickening drop in his stomach that an apology was not going to be enough. He didn't just have to win her. He had to convince her that she was safe enough to let him try. The silence in the castle changed. It was no longer the silence of two ghosts avoiding each other. It was the silence of a siege. Aidan stopped trying to force conversation. He stopped lingering in the doorways of the rooms Amelia occupied. The carriage ride had stripped him of his delusions. She was entirely correct. He had treated her like a transaction, and now that the transaction was proving highly profitable, both financially and domestically, he was demanding the fringe benefits of a loving wife. It was arrogance in its purest form. Apologies were cheap air. Aidan knew he had to pay an entirely different coin. January brought a brutal, wet freeze. The moors turned into a sprawling bog of half-frozen mud. With the damp came the fever. It started in the lower village, among the tenant farmers who lived closest to the river. Dr. Harrison, an overworked man with a perpetually stained waistcoat, arrived at Fenwick Castle just after dawn on a Tuesday. He did not ask for the Duke. He asked for the Duchess. Aidan was in the library, attempting to decipher the very ledgers he had previously ignored, when he heard the commotion in the hall. He stepped out to see Amelia shrugging into a heavy, unadorned wool cloak. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, was anxiously packing a wicker basket with jars of beef broth, clean linens, and heavy blocks of lye soap. "What is happening?" Aidan asked, stepping into the foyer. Amelia tied the strings of her cloak under her chin. She didn't look at him. "There's an outbreak of sweating sickness in the lower village. 5 families are down. The doctor says it will spread if the linens aren't boiled and the fires aren't kept high." "I will send the footmen," Aidan said instinctively. "The footmen are boys," Amelia replied sharply, finally looking up. Her eyes were hard. "They will catch it, and then they will bring it back here. Dr. Harrison and I have survived it before. I am going." She turned and walked out the heavy oak doors before he could utter another word of protest. Aidan stood in the quiet hall. The old Aidan, the proud wounded Duke of Rothbury, would have retreated to his study. He would have rationalized that the peasantry was entirely used to illness, that his wife was being overly dramatic, and that a duke's place was above the fray. Aidan went upstairs, stripped off his tailored broadcloth coat and silk cravat, and pulled on a heavy scarred leather riding jacket and boots. When he reached the lower village, the smell hit him first. It was the sour, metallic stench of unwashed bodies, damp wool, and illness. The village was a cluster of stone cottages with thatched roofs that sagged under the weight of the winter rain. He found Amelia in the cottage of the blacksmith, a burly man named Miller who was currently shaking so violently the small wooden cot threatened to splinter beneath him. Amelia had her sleeves rolled up past her elbows. She was plunging coarse sheets into a boiling copper vat over the hearth, using a heavy wooden paddle to stir them. Her face was flushed red from the heat, her dark hair slipping from its pins to stick to her damp forehead. She looked nothing like a duchess. She looked like a laborer. Aidan stepped through the low doorway. The air inside was stifling. Amelia glanced over her shoulder. She froze for a fraction of a second, the heavy wooden paddle slipping slightly in her grip. She stared at his boots, at his leather jacket, and finally at his face. "You shouldn't be here," she said. Her voice was flat, but he could hear the ragged edge of exhaustion already creeping in. "It's highly contagious." "So are you," Aidan replied quietly. He didn't wait for her permission. He walked past her to the corner of the room where the blacksmith's terrified eldest son was hopelessly trying to chop wet firewood with a dull hatchet. Aidan took the hatchet from the boy's hands. For the next 14 hours, the Duke of Rothbury hauled wood. He carried buckets of water from the freezing river until his hands bled inside his gloves. He held down screaming, feverish children while Dr. Harrison forced bitter medicine down their throats. He stripped soiled beds and hauled the mattresses out into the freezing rain to be burned. He did not speak to Amelia. He simply worked beside her. Whenever she reached for a heavy bucket, his hand was already on the handle, lifting it away. When the fires began to dip, he was there with split timber. He subordinated himself entirely to her rhythm. He became her extra set of hands, her brute strength, her silent shadow. Late that night, they were in the cottage of a young widow. The woman's fever had finally broken, and she was sleeping peacefully. Dr. Harrison had moved on to the next house. The cottage was quiet, save for the crackle of the hearth. Aidan sat on a low three-legged stool near the fire. He was covered in soot, mud, and someone else's vomit. He stared into the flames, too tired to move his jaw. He heard the rustle of wool. Amelia walked over and stood near the hearth. She held out a battered tin cup. "Drink it," she said. "It's just hot water and a bit of honey, but it will strip the soot from your throat." Aidan took the cup. His fingers brushed hers. She didn't flinch away this time, but she withdrew her hand quickly. "Thank you," he rasped. He drank the hot liquid. It tasted like heaven. Amelia leaned against the stone mantel. She stared down at him. The firelight cast long, flickering shadows across her face. "Why are you here, Aidan?" she asked softly. It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine, exhausted inquiry. "This is not your world. You loathe the dirt." Aidan lowered the tin cup. He looked up at her, letting her see the utter depletion in his gray eyes. No armor, no pride. "Because you are here," he said simply. "And because I am beginning to realize that the dirt is the only place where anything real is built." Amelia stared at him. Her throat worked as she swallowed. She looked away, staring into the fire, her arms wrapping tightly around her own waist, holding her protective walls together by sheer physical force. She did not say a word. But for the first time since their wedding day, she didn't walk away. The fever broke its grip on the village 10 days later. 2 elders had passed, but the children and the working men survived. It was a victory, but it felt like a battlefield. When Aidan and Amelia finally walked back up the long gravel drive to Fenwick Castle, they moved like the walking dead. It was twilight. The sky was the color of a bruised plum. Amelia tripped on a loose stone. She didn't cry out, but she stumbled heavily, her knees hitting the wet gravel. Aidan caught her before she could collapse entirely. He gripped her by the arms, hauling her upward. She was trembling. Not a delicate shiver, but a deep, violent tremor that started in her bones. "I'm fine," she muttered, her words slurring slightly. She tried to pull away. "I'm just tired." "Stop fighting me, Amelia," Aiden said. His voice lacked any heat. It was just a weary plea. "Just for 5 minutes. Let me carry the weight." He didn't give her a choice. He swung her up into his arms. Amelia gasped, a sharp intake of breath. She stiffened, her hands instinctively pressing against his chest to push him away, but she had no strength left. Her head dropped heavily against his shoulder. He smelled of smoke, sweat, and freezing rain. Aiden carried her through the front doors. Mrs. Gable rushed forward, her eyes wide, but Aiden shook his head. "Draw a hot bath in the Duchess's chambers," he ordered, "and bring up tea and bread." He carried her up the grand staircase. He kicked her bedroom door open and set her down gently in the armchair by the unlit fireplace. Amelia slumped into the cushions. She looked terrible. Dark, bruised circles hung beneath her eyes. Her skin was a pallid, unhealthy gray. She stared blankly at the wall, her hands resting limply in her lap. Aiden knelt in front of the grate. He built a fire quickly, his movements mechanical. He coaxed the kindling into a blaze, then added the heavier logs. The heat radiated outward, slowly warming the freezing room. He turned back to her. She hadn't moved. He walked over to the washstand, poured warm water from the pitcher into the porcelain bowl, and grabbed a clean linen cloth. He knelt in front of her chair. Amelia blinked, pulling her focus back to the room. She looked down at him, confused. Aiden took her right hand. It was raw, the knuckles cracked and bleeding from the harsh lye soap in the freezing water. He dipped the cloth into the warm water and began to gently wash the grime from her skin. "I can do that," she whispered. "I know you can," Aiden said, not looking up. He moved the cloth over her bruised knuckles with agonizing care. "You can do everything, Amelia. You've made that perfectly clear, but tonight, you don't have to." He rinsed the cloth and moved to her left hand. He washed away the soot, carefully cleaning around the heavy gold wedding band that he had placed there months ago in a cold, damp church. Amelia watched the top of his head. Her breathing was shallow. "You shouldn't have come to the village," she said, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "You could have died. So could you. My life is a matter of utility. Yours is a matter of lineage." Aiden stopped washing her hand. He didn't drop it. He just held it tightly in both of his, resting them against his knee. He looked up. "My lineage is ash, Amelia. It means nothing. The only thing of value in this entire house is sitting in this chair." Amelia closed her eyes. A single treacherous tear escaped, cutting a clean track through the soot on her cheek. She turned her face away, utterly furious with herself for the weakness. "Don't," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Please, Aiden, don't do this." "Don't do what?" he asked softly. "Don't be kind to me." She opened her eyes, looking back at him with a raw, desperate vulnerability. "I can survive your cruelty. I can survive your indifference. I built a house out of your rejection, Aiden, and I know how to live in it. But if you give me kindness, if you make me hope, and then you take it away because your pride rears up again." She swallowed hard, her throat bobbing. "I will not survive that. You will break me." Aiden felt the words like a physical blade sliding between his ribs. He saw the absolute terror in her eyes. It wasn't fear of a tyrant. It was the fear of a woman who had meticulously calculated the exact amount of pain she could endure and knew that hope would throw off the entire equation. He didn't pull her into his arms. He didn't make grand, sweeping promises about eternal love. He knew his words were bankrupt. He gently dried her hands with the towel. He stood up. "The bathwater is ready," he said smoothly, keeping his voice perfectly level. He stepped back, giving her the physical space she so desperately needed. "I will have Mrs. Gable bring your tea up immediately." He walked to the door. He put his hand on the brass knob and paused. He didn't look back at her. "I broke you once, Amelia. It is the greatest failure of my life. I'm not asking you to dismantle your house. I'm only asking you to leave the door unlocked. Let me sit on the porch. I will wait as long as it takes." He stepped out into the hallway and pulled the door shut behind him with a soft click. Inside the room, Amelia stared at the closed door. The heat from the fire washed over her. She looked down at her clean hands. For the first time in 6 months, the heavy gold ring on her left finger didn't feel quite so much like a shackle. Spring arrived at Fenwick Castle not with a sudden burst of blooming flowers, but with a slow, agonizing thaw. The ice melted into a thick, sucking mud that coated the boots of the stable hands and the wheels of the carts. Aidan kept his promise. He sat on the porch. He did not crowd Amelia. He did not ask for late-night conversations by the fire, nor did he attempt to touch her again. Instead, he embedded himself into the machinery of her daily life. Before the sweating sickness, Aidan had been a ghost haunting his own home. Now, he was the foundation. When Amelia sat in the study, parsing out the spring planting budgets, Aidan was out in the fields with the new steward, arguing over soil drainage and crop rotation. He returned each evening smelling of turned earth and sweat, his hands calloused, the sharp aristocratic pallor of his skin burnt a dull, healthy brown by the wind. He stopped drinking brandy in the afternoons. He stopped riding his horse to the point of collapse. He simply worked. Amelia watched him. She observed him from the windows of the study, noting the way the tenant farmers no longer lowered their eyes in sullen resentment when he passed, but actively called out to him. She watched him pull a mired cart out of a ditch alongside two laborers, his shoulder pressed against the muddy wheel, ruining a very expensive coat without a second thought. It was terrifying. It was easy to hate the cruel, proud duke who had dismissed her in the library. It was incredibly difficult to maintain a fortress against a man who quietly took over the tedious correspondence with her father's solicitors, simply because he noticed the letters gave her a headache. The dinners changed. One evening in late April, Aidan walked into the vast dining room. Amelia was already seated at her usual spot, 20 feet away at the far end of the mahogany table. Aidan looked at the expanse of polished wood between them. He didn't say a word. He simply picked up his heavy dining chair, carried it down the length of the room, and set it firmly on the right side of her, at the corner of the table. Amelia froze, her soup spoon halfway to her mouth. She stared at him. Aidan sat down, shook out his linen napkin, and placed it on his lap. "The timber yields from the northern ridge are 10% higher than we projected," he said conversationally, signaling for the footman to pour his wine. "I believe we can afford to replace the roof on the lower barns after all." He didn't look at her for approval. He didn't ask for permission to sit there. He just claimed the space. Amelia carefully lowered her spoon. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked at the sharp profile of his face, the gray eyes focused on the footman, the relaxed set of his broad shoulders. "The lower barns," she managed to say, her voice remarkably steady. "Yes, that would be practical." From that night on, the distance was bridged. They didn't speak of love. They spoke of crop yields, roof slates, and the rising cost of flour. But they spoke, and the silence that filled the spaces between their words was no longer a weapon. It was a shared, comfortable quiet. The true test arrived in May, in the form of heavy parchment sealed with black wax. Amelia was opening the Morning Post in the breakfast room when she saw the handwriting. Her stomach dropped. It was from her father, Thomas Osgood. Aidan walked in, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He paused, noticing the sudden rigidity of her spine. "Bad news?" Amelia set the letter down. "My father. He's coming to Fenwick next week. He wishes to inspect his investment." She waited for the flinch. She waited for the proud Duke of Rothbury to bristle at the idea of a coal merchant treating his ancestral home like a factory floor. This was the trigger. This was the moment Aidan's pride would violently resurface and shatter the fragile peace they had built. Aidan took a sip of his coffee. He looked at the letter, then at Amelia. "Excellent," he said evenly. "We should put him in the Queen's suite. It has the best draft protection, and I will have Mrs. Gable speak to the butcher in the village. We'll need a proper roast." Amelia stared at him, entirely derailed. "Aidan, he's not coming for a social call. He's coming to audit us. He will walk through your halls and tally your worth. He will treat you like a subordinate." Aidan set his cup down. He leaned across the small table, his gray eyes holding hers with a calm, unshakable certainty. "Amelia, let him audit. Let him tally. He will find a prosperous estate. He will find ledgers balanced to the penny." He reached out, his calloused finger tapping the table inches from her hand. "And he will find that he is a guest in my house. I am not the desperate, drowning boy he bought a year ago. I have nothing to prove to Thomas Osgood. The only person in this world whose judgment I fear is sitting across from me." He withdrew his hand, picked up his coffee, and walked toward the door. "I will go inform the stables to prepare the best carriages for his arrival." Amelia sat alone in the breakfast room. The morning sun streamed through the glass, catching the dust motes in the air. She pressed her hands over her face, taking a long, shuddering breath. Her fortress wasn't just cracking, it was turning to dust. And the man outside wasn't holding a battering ram. He was holding a broom, patiently sweeping away the debris. Thomas Osgood arrived, blustered, inspected, and left. He had walked the grounds with Aidan, pointing a thick gold-ringed finger at the barns and the timber yards, giving gruff, unsolicited advice. Aidan had listened politely, nodded when appropriate, and calmly deflected every attempt the older man made to exert authority. When Osgood had tried to question the steward's wages at dinner, Aidan had simply smiled and said, "You must direct your inquiry to the Duchess, sir. She is the architect of our financial success. I merely execute her vision." Amelia had watched her father, a man who terrified shipping magnates and politicians alike, blink in stunned silence, entirely disarmed by a duke who possessed no ego to bruise. It was a quiet victory, but it shifted the tectonic plates of their marriage. June arrived, bringing a thick, heavy heat to the Moors. It also brought their first anniversary. Neither of them mentioned it. There were no gifts, no grand declarations. Amelia spent the day locked in the study, agonizingly focused on the master ledger for the year. At 9 o'clock that evening, she drew a single thick black line under the final column. She stared at the number. The estate was solvent. The massive debts Aidan's father had accrued were paid. The tenant farms were turning a profit. The dowry her father had provided was no longer the only thing keeping the roof from caving in. The transaction was complete. Amelia closed the heavy leather book. The thud echoed in the quiet study. She picked it up and walked out into the corridor. The castle was silent, the servants having retired for the night. She walked down the long, shadowed hall toward the library. The door was ajar. A fire crackled in the hearth, a stark contrast to the cold, dead grate she remembered from a year ago. Aidan was standing by the window, a glass of whiskey in his hand, looking out at the moonlit grounds. He wore a simple white linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up, his waistcoat discarded on a nearby chair. Amelia pushed the door open. Aidan turned. The tension in his jaw relaxed the moment he saw her. He set his glass down on the sill. "You worked too late," he murmured. Amelia walked toward the center of the room. The heavy velvet of her skirts brushed against the Persian rug. She stopped by the grand desk and placed the ledger down with deliberate care. "It is finished," she said. Aidan frowned slightly, walking toward her. "What is finished?" "The audit for the year." Amelia folded her hands in front of her. She kept her spine straight, but it took a monumental effort. "The final debts to the London creditors were cleared this morning. The estate is running at an 8% profit. The structural repairs are complete." Aidan stopped a few feet away. He looked at the ledger, then back at her face. The warmth in his eyes slowly faded, replaced by a guarded, sharp apprehension. "I don't understand." "It means," Amelia said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "that the contract is fulfilled. You are no longer financially bound to my father's money. You are solvent, Aidan. You have your title, your home, and your independence." She took a slow breath. This was it. This was the moment she gave him back the choice he had been denied. If you wish," she continued, forcing the words past the tightening in her throat, "we can establish separate lives. You can take a residence in London. I will remain here and manage the northern accounts. You would be free." Silence fell over the library. It was the same thick, oppressive silence of their wedding day, but this time it vibrated with a terrifying, electric charge. Aidan stared at her, his face drained of color. He looked at the leather book on the desk as if it were a venomous snake. "Is that what you want?" he asked. His voice was completely devoid of emotion. It was a dead, flat sound. Amelia looked at the floor. "It is what you wanted. A year ago, you made it very clear." "I asked you a question, Amelia." Aidan took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "Is this what you want?" She closed her eyes. The urge to lie to maintain the armor was a physical ache in her muscles. It was so easy to be cold. It was safe. But she remembered the soot on his face in the village. She remembered the gentle pressure of his hands washing the dirt from her knuckles. She remembered a year of quiet, unglamorous devotion. She opened her eyes and looked up at him. "No," she whispered. The words shattered in the air between them. "No, it isn't what I want. But I cannot hold you hostage to a marriage you did not choose." Aiden exhaled a harsh, jagged breath. He didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, closing the final few inches between them. He reached out, not for her hand, but for her face. His large, rough hands cupped her cheeks, his thumbs resting against her cheekbones. Amelia gasped at the contact. The heat of his skin burned through the chill of her fear. "You foolish, brilliant woman," he murmured, his voice thick with a desperate, heavy relief. He tilted her face up, forcing her to meet his gaze. His gray eyes were fierce, burning with absolute certainty. "You think you are keeping me hostage? You think I am looking for an exit? You said—" "I was a fool," he cut her off, his thumbs brushing lightly across her skin. "I was a terrified, arrogant fool who didn't know the value of gold until it was dropped in his lap. I don't care about the ledger, Amelia. I don't care about the debts or the profits or the title." He leaned closer, his forehead resting gently against hers. "You were forced upon me," Aiden whispered, his breath warm against her lips. "And it was the greatest stroke of luck I will ever possess. I did not choose you then, Amelia. But I am choosing you now. Every day. For the rest of my miserable, fortunate life. I choose you." Amelia let out a ragged, breaking sob. The fortress crumbled entirely, collapsing into dust around her feet. She raised her hands, burying her fingers in the thick hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him down to her. Aiden kissed her. There was no hesitation, no polite restraint. It was a kiss built on a year of repressed longing, of shared labor, of desperate, terrifying hope. He pulled her against his chest, wrapping his arms around her waist, anchoring her to him. Amelia kissed him back with a fierce, answering hunger, tasting the salt of her own tears against his mouth. They stood in the center of the library, surrounded by the ghosts of their bitter beginning, finally breathing life into the ruins. When Aiden finally pulled back, he didn't let her go. He kept his arms wrapped tightly around her, burying his face in the curve of her neck, inhaling the scent of bergamot and clean soap. Amelia rested her head against his chest. She listened to the steady, strong beat of his heart. She looked past his shoulder at the heavy leather ledger sitting on the desk. The debts were paid. The contract was over. The marriage had finally begun. The walls have fallen, the ledgers are closed, and the Duke and Duchess of Rothbury have finally found their way through the ruins of an arranged marriage. Real romance isn't always born in ballrooms. Sometimes it's forged in the cold mud and quiet devotion of a shared life. If you loved watching Amelia hold her ground and Aiden finally earn his place by her side, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who appreciates a grounded, hard-fought love story. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next tale.